Everyone. My name is Rashmi Diyalchand, and I'm the chair this year of the Property Law section. And on behalf of my co-organizers, Etienne Toussaint of the section on Clinical Legal Education, and Camille Panu and Priya Bhaskaran of the section on Community Economic Development, I am delighted to welcome you to this joint session on a right to housing, law and activism to eradicate homelessness. I have the privilege of serving as the moderator for this first of two linked panels. In this first panel, we will hear from three speakers who will speak to the concept of a right to housing from their three different vantage points. They will present both legal and non-legal perspectives on the need for such a right and on the possibilities of its pragmatic implementation. I will introduce each of the speakers in the order in which they speak, and so we'll begin with our first speaker, Maria Foscarinas, who is the founder and executive director of the National Homelessness Law Center, as well as a lecturer in law at Columbia Law School. Maria founded the National Homelessness Law Center in 1989, and as she describes it on the center's website, she had one goal in mind in doing so: to end homelessness in America. Maria, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rashmi. It's really great to be here on this exciting and important panel. Homelessness was a crisis in the United States before the pandemic struck. And now the economic crisis that COVID-19 has precipitated has made it a much, much deeper crisis. But for the interventions of the CARES Act, enacted last spring, and the various eviction moratoria in place around the country, it would be even worse yet. I'm going to talk about what we as lawyers can do and are doing in response, and why embedding housing as a right in U.S. law is critical to ending and preventing homelessness in the United States. So in addition to a crisis in homelessness, there's an affordable housing crisis in this country, and that's not a coincidence. Lack of affordable housing is what drives homelessness primarily, and that's true especially for extremely poor people. So there's been a remarkable loss in the availability of affordable housing starting in the in the decade of the 1970s, when gentrification resulted in the loss of hundreds of thousands of units of extremely affordable housing, primarily single-room occupancy housing in cities around the country. But then in the early 1980s, funding for affordable housing programs at the federal level was dramatically cut. And that really led to the explosion in homelessness across the country. So cuts that were very drastic beginning in 1980, that funding was never replaced. And as a result, right now, only 1 in 4 of people who are poor enough to be eligible for federal low-income housing assistance actually receive it. Even emergency shelter is lacking. So not that shelter is the solution to homelessness, but even that, as a temporary response, is greatly lacking. Shelters across the country are at or over capacity and regularly turn people away because they simply don't have the capacity to help. It may not be truly available. It often comes with religious requirements or is not able to serve people with special needs. So it's not a solution, and in any case, it's not available for many people in many places. As a result of this, People living on the streets are on the increase. Unsheltered homelessness is increasing. Encampments, people living in tents or makeshift arrangements in public places around the country are growing very rapidly. These are some numbers from a report that my organization published recently that showed really dramatic increases. And these are according to inexact proxy measures that are probably actually undercounting the extent of the growth. But we found an astonishing over 1,300% growth in encampments over a 10-year period. And at the same time, on a parallel course, laws that criminalize people for living in public are also increasing. So my organization has also been tracking the growth of these types of laws in the same 187 cities across the country since 2006. So we have noted increases across the board, and especially in some cases. And by criminalizing, I mean making it illegal to sleep in public, to camp in public, to sit or lie down in public, to loiter, loaf. There are any number of variants of these types of laws. And notably, laws that prohibit living in vehicles have had the sharpest increase, over 200%. And that's probably also not a coincidence. It's probably because as rents go up, people are resorting to living in their vehicles as a last resort. So this is just an image of the chair of the UN Human Rights Committee responding to the presentation of our materials on this state of affairs. Among other strategies, we and other advocates have called upon human rights entities to condemn this trend, and that actually has had some impact in terms of shifting policy at the federal level, and in some cases at the local level. Oops, that's a mistake. Oh, okay. So I'm sorry, I apologize. Looks like I have the wrong slide here. What this is supposed to be, it's missing most of the slide, but I wanted to talk about another strategy that's very important that we have adopted to challenge these laws, which is litigating. So we and other advocates have litigated in courts, in federal courts and state courts around the country to challenge laws that criminalize homelessness as unconstitutional. And the most recent major case is a landmark ruling from the Ninth Circuit called Martin v. Boise. And in that case, which we brought together with our local partner in Boise, Idaho, the Legal Aid Society there, and Latham and Watkins, pro bono law firm working with us, the court ruled that criminally punishing people for living outside, for sleeping outside when they have no alternative indoor place to sleep, is a violation of the Eighth Amendment. It's cruel and unusual punishment to make it a crime for someone to sleep outside when there's no indoor place for them. And that's a very powerful ruling. It's a case we litigated for 10 years. It went up and down, and we ended up with this great Ninth Circuit court ruling. And thankfully, from our perspective, the Supreme Court declined review, so that ruling stands. It's from about a year ago, and it's already had an impact. It's been cited and followed by courts outside the circuit. It's had an impact within the circuit. But what it says is it doesn't require anybody to create any housing. It just says you can't punish someone for not having it. And so it's powerful, but very limited as well. So let me see if I can find the next slide. This is just a on additional points, in addition to human rights concerns, constitutional concerns, there are also practical concerns. Studies recently have shown how expensive it is to deploy police to arrest or fine homeless people as opposed to simply solve the problem by housing people. And so we have cost studies that show this, and recently there has been public policy to actually implement this in the form of ballot initiatives. Last November, this is Measure J in LA County, but a number of communities around the country passed ballot initiatives as part of the broader call to defund the police, which is kind of an inexact phrase because it really is about shifting resources away from law enforcement and towards services. So Measure J and others like it call for shifting funds to housing and other social services and away from law enforcement, not specifically on the issue of homelessness, but also including the issue of homelessness. So that is another strategy that we and others support. Now, there are alternatives to criminalizing homelessness, and there are short-term alternatives, there are longer-term alternatives. Among the short-term alternatives are low-barrier shelter that is truly available to everybody who needs it. Still not a solution. There are other short-term solutions like safe parking lots for people living in their vehicles, tiny homes, which can be either short or longer-term solutions. But the true long-term solution is housing, sufficient housing that is affordable to people who are extremely low income and homeless. So that brings us to the call for the human right to housing. That's what we really need to truly end and prevent homelessness. And why do I say that? Well, because remember, I started by saying that right now funding has been cut so much that only 1 in 4 of those who are poor enough to be eligible for federal housing assistance actually receives it. Well, that's because funding for housing, for low-income housing, is discretionary. It's not a right. That means it doesn't have to be funded to scale. Making housing a right would mean that our policies must be such that there's sufficient funding, that funding is prioritized so that anyone who is poor enough to be eligible for assistance actually receives it. It's important to note that making housing a right doesn't mean that everybody automatically gets a free home. No, it means that we have rational policies that prioritize housing and make sure that we as a society invest the resources needed to make sure that everybody who needs it can get housing assistance. This is possible. There are models of communities that have implemented and countries that have implemented a right to housing. For example, Scotland actually is a pioneer in this, and years ago enacted legislation calling for the right and implementing a right to housing for all homeless people. And it's a phased system. It's a statutory system that is phased in and it's legally enforceable. It's been revised a number of times over the years. It has not been perfect, but over time it's been improved. And it is a real demonstration that this is possible. It is possible to implement and make this a workable model. Just last month, the Open Society Foundation foundations in collaboration with human rights organizations in Europe published a report and model legislation to implement the right to housing during the pandemic. And that contains a number of provisions, including eviction moratoria, mortgage moratoria, funding for housing, caps on a freeze on rents, assistance for rental payments, a very comprehensive range of strategies to implement the right to housing tailored to the pandemic. So, and there are also initiatives in Congress and in states around the country. So right now there's pending in the House Housing is a Human Right Act. That's something spearheaded by Congresswoman Jayapal. It's something we've worked with her very closely on. It's not a full right to housing. It has a lot of provisions to prevent criminalization and to increase funding for housing. But it is a step in that direction, and words matter, as we know, and that's our theme, and having that in a piece of federal legislation is significant. In California, there's a proposal to amend the state constitution to include the right to housing, something, again, that we're working on, and a legislative proposal to adopt a right to housing in the state of Connecticut. The Biden-Harris platform includes the statement that housing should be a right, not a privilege. So this is an idea that is starting to gain traction, and this is very exciting. It's something that we have been calling for, we and advocates, other advocates have been calling for decades, and it is finally starting to come into mainstream discourse. And that's just illustrates the fact that it often takes decades for ideas like this to become part of the mainstream conversation. But I think it also illustrates the impact of the pandemic. So the pandemic has really made clear the importance of housing and the importance, as we've been told that we need to stay home, we need to isolate. Well, if you don't have a home, you can't stay home. And that has implications not just for the people directly affected. And of course, people who are homeless are more vulnerable to COVID. They're more likely to die. They're less able to protect themselves. But it's not just that impact, it's impact on entire communities. And so this has given, I think, further impetus to the call to view housing as a right and not a privilege. And so I think the moment really is now to make this push, and I think it can happen, and we have models that show that it can be implemented. And I think the bottom line is that housing has to be a priority, and that's calling it and making it a right a right is the step that we need right now to achieve that goal.
Thanks so much, Maria. And we're going to make a transition now to our second speaker, but as we do it, our second speaker is Mark Jolin. I'll introduce Mark in just a moment. As we make that transition, let me just lay out for you, since this is our first day of a virtual conference, my understanding of how you can ask questions, because you might already be starting to generate questions. We hope to have plenty of time for audience participation, but audience participation will be a little different than it would be if we were all in a large hotel ballroom together. So what you need to do, and Nick, who is our tech person, just interrupt me and correct anything that I say incorrectly if I get it wrong. But what you need to do is you need to go to our session, and you probably are already there if you're watching. And on that screen, there is a chat area in which you can write your question, and I will be moderating that public chat area. And then I will be happy to pose your questions to the speakers after all three speakers have finished speaking. If, as you write your question, you could include some information about who you are, your name, and any biographical information that you're comfortable sharing, that would be wonderful, so that I can essentially stand in for you and describe the question a little bit from your perspective when I share it with our speakers. Unfortunately, we can't give you the opportunity to ask your question yourself, but hopefully that will give you the ability to, or at least give me the ability to speak a little bit through your voice. Okay, having said that, now let me turn to introducing our second speaker, who is Mark Jolin. And Mark has, I think, addressed the issue of homelessness and housing rights from a range of perspectives, but currently that vantage point is as the director of the Joint Office of Homeless Services, which is a shared office, or at least it shares a commitment on the parts of both Multnomah County, Oregon, and the city of Portland, Oregon, to make access to housing-related services easier to attain. And among other things, that office administers contracts for services, conducts homeless street counts and one-night shelter counts, and manages systems of care, along with overseeing system reporting and evaluation. I'm sure Mark will be able to tell you more about that, as well as other perspectives for which he's addressed the issue of homelessness. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rashmi. It's wonderful to be here. The only thing that I'll add, given the audience, is that I am an attorney and had the privilege of being a legal services attorney for a number of years, working on some of the very kinds of issues that Maria was just talking about in terms of the criminalization of people experiencing homelessness. So this is work that I've been doing for a long time in various roles. And as Rashmi said, I now work for the local government, implementing our ending homelessness strategies in the community. And that includes partnering with over 40 nonprofit organizations that are delivering services to adults who are currently unsheltered through outreach shelter and housing programs, domestic violence survivors, families with children, youth. So our office is really the lead agency in our local community for the implementation of our ending homelessness strategies, broadly defined. So I'm happy to be here. I think what I can share is, to a large extent, what happens when we don't have a right to housing, and some of the steps that we've been trying to take locally to push ourselves in that direction, given the crisis that we see on our streets every day. In terms of what we see as a result of the absence of a right to housing, I think first and foremost, Maria called it out in her presentation, and that is just a desperate lack of federal investment in our low-income housing portfolios across the country, and in particular, an inability to generate housing for the lowest income people in our communities, people who are extremely low income, who are earning or have incomes of 30% of the area median income or below. That is where across the board we see the biggest deficits, and certainly in our community, we have estimates that in Multnomah County, we're short about 30,000 units of housing with rents at that level of affordability right now. And that is an enormous deficit. And unfortunately, despite some of our efforts that I'll talk about, that deficit just continues to grow. Because we don't have a federal strategy, a lot of the responsibility for addressing our housing affordability crisis has devolved to the states and to local jurisdictions. And the states and the local jurisdictions take very different approaches. It leads to a lot of inequities and sort of inefficiencies, for lack of a better term, in terms of how we think about the delivery of this fundamental need for shelter that everybody in our communities has. Our inability at the local level to address the need for deeply affordable housing in particular, given the absence of a sufficient federal strategy and investment, has first the consequence of having tens of thousands of people who are severely rent burdened. I think Maria's slide showed 6.5 million people paying more than 30% of their income on rent. That impact, and I think this is true across the country, falls significantly disproportionately on communities of color. And in our community, we do an annual housing report. What we know is that the median Black family in our community cannot find affordable housing in any of the neighborhoods of our community. What you see there is that historic deprivation of access to opportunity and wealth for our communities of color. It shows up as median incomes for Black households in our community at $30,000 as compared to white households that are at $66,000. So not only then do we see severe rent burdens among our communities of color, but then disproportionate rates of homelessness as well. Where, of course, we have the biggest gaps, as I said, is in that deeply affordable housing for people who make 30% of area median income and below. And those are some of our most vulnerable households. We have in Multnomah County about 22,000 people who rely on supplemental security income as their primary source of income. That's less than $800 a month. There is simply no housing in our community, certainly in the private market, that anyone on that kind of an income can afford. And so as a result, if we can't provide a subsidized unit, then those folks are winding up on our streets and in our shelters. And I can tell you that our streets and our shelters, 70% of the people who we count in our point in time count self-identify as having serious disabling conditions, often multiple disabling conditions. And many of them have that SSI income but can't find housing. The other consequence of our inability to provide housing to folks and our local jurisdictional challenges with providing housing is the sort of way that homelessness gets framed as an issue in the community. So we necessarily, given that the need is what it is out there, our homeless service system is simply underfunded to respond to the need. And the consequence is that in Multnomah County, we know we have 4,000 people on any given night who are sleeping outside or in a shelter. That perpetuation of homelessness and visible homelessness in particular puts an enormous amount of public pressure on our elected officials to respond. There's a growing level of frustration that we have in parts of the community around not just the fact that we have people experiencing homelessness, but the impact that homelessness is having on residential areas, on businesses, and so forth. And the pressure then grows to spend more money, not on ending homelessness, but on managing those impacts. And that's a challenge, because in the absence of sufficient resources, when I have a budget or we have a budget to go towards addressing homelessness, the more folks are asking us to spend resources on cleanups or on hygiene stations or even on shelter, those investments are coming directly at the expense of the resources we would use to actually move people into housing and help them keep that housing. And that's an unfortunate trade-off and a reality that we face locally. Maria raised the Boise case, and it really does. It's a tremendous ruling, and the way that it is playing out to some extent in our local communities is worth talking about, which is because of the nature of the ruling. There are a lot of folks who are looking at that Boise case as creating not a right to housing, but a right to shelter. And again, that in a resource limited environment can work against our efforts to house folks if we are asked to guarantee a shelter bed to everybody. And I think it's one of the things that collectively we have to grapple with. And I will say that in our community, there's a recognition that shelter is not a solution, and that's not how Boise should be used, but it is a tension that we see from some voices in our community. And then finally, and we see this with a lot of social service and human services programs that we know work for the people who they are designed to serve and who get access to them, end up being undermined because we can't scale them. So rather than understanding that the reason we continue to have so many people in shelter in our community is that we haven't made enough of an investment in things like permanent supportive housing, folks look and say, well, the strategies that your homeless services system is deploying must be failing, or we wouldn't have all of these people who are still outside. So the system becomes the source of the problem rather than the solution, and just an underfunded set of solutions. And that's a challenge. It also manifests then in narratives around people choosing homelessness or sort of essentially blaming the folks who are outside for the situation that they find themselves in. All of those things work against us as we try to address the real needs that we see in our community. So what do we do locally? First and foremost, the advocacy work that Maria was just talking about, continuing to insist that housing is a human right. continuing to work with our federal delegations to make affordable housing, and especially deeply affordable housing, a priority at the federal level, to preserve the infrastructure that we currently have, to produce more, and to put more resources into the long-term rent supports and support services that people need. We also have to continue to insist that housing ends homelessness, not encampments or mass shelters. In our community, we are investing in shelter. It is part of our strategy, but we are insisting that with every shelter bed we open, we make investments in our capacity to move people out of those shelter beds and into housing. It's a both and, but too often, again, the solutions to homelessness are really solutions to mitigating the fact that we haven't solved homelessness. It's mitigating the impact of the fact that people are outside. We have to remember that the true solution is housing folks and supporting them in their housing once they're there. We're making a lot of local investments. Maria pointed out that around the country there have been important funding measures to try to address at least some of the gap at the federal level. In our community, we've passed local affordable housing bonds for the development of affordable housing. And in the last year, we passed something called the Metro Supportive Housing Services Measure, which for the first time is a regional tri-county voter-approved measure that will generate $250 million a year to put towards long-term rent assistance and support services. That's a 10-year measure, $2.5 billion. I think it's per capita one of the largest voter-approved investments in affordable housing in the country. And we're in the process now of planning for how to implement that. That has the potential to be transformative, and it will really work. The focus of that measure is on the chronically homeless population. Those people who have been outside the longest need that long-term deep subsidy and some wraparound support services in many cases. And then finally, a whole package of legislative reforms in our local community. We've adopted regulations on rate of rent increases. We have adopted no-cause eviction prevention. Well, let me do that differently. Prohibitions on no-cause evictions at the local level and then at the state level. And then locally, we had adopted a set of provisions last year that limit landlords' ability to screen people out of housing for things like eviction histories and criminal histories. On the side of trying to increase production, we've done a lot locally with zoning and land use. So we've had an initiative to increase what we call middle housing. So taking single family zones and insisting that we be able to build duplexes and fourplexes. That's now also something that's happened at the state level for us. That's important. Pushing back on some of the things that try to protect, so historic neighborhood designations and things like that tend to reduce our ability to add inventory. We have an inclusionary zoning or inclusionary housing ordinance that was adopted. So those types of legislative changes at the local level have been really important. We are also doing a lot of work to expand our capacity to site shelter, in particular in community. So we have a commitment, if we're going to do shelter, to not isolate that shelter outside of community, outside of where resources are, libraries, parks, the things that everybody needs access to. And we've had some success with that. And then finally, a whole range of measures looking at trying to bring the cost bring the cost of housing down. And I know that's a popular conversation. Some modifications to regulations around building and so forth, streamlining some of our permitting processes, and revisiting historic models of housing development like SROs, which for a long time went out of favor, but which we have been investing in, again, trying to find that balance between a dignified living environment and the fact that we have such scarce resources to invest in affordable housing right now. So I'll stop there. Hopefully I'm within my time, and I'm happy to answer questions. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Mark. Okay, and we have one more speaker before we open it up for questions and answers and discussion, and that is Stephanie Senna. Stephanie is the founder and executive director of the student-run Emergency Housing Unit of Philadelphia, which is a nonprofit homeless shelter operating since 2011. Students in this organization provide shelter, food, and community to individuals experiencing homelessness in Philadelphia. Stephanie is also the Villanova University Anti-Poverty Fellow and a full-time faculty member at the Villanova Law School. So, Stephanie, with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rashmi, and for that introduction. I am incredibly humbled to be in this session with Maria and Mark. I want to start off with a fascinating piece of information that Congresswoman Mary Gay Scanlon told me last week. She told me that in the United States, annually, we spend more money on Halloween costumes for our pets than we do in legal aid for people who are experiencing homelessness and who are low income. I think that was startling and important to keep in mind while I discuss the need for lawyers and law students in promoting the right to housing. And I'm going to be talking about a case study in Philadelphia from this past summer, the summer of 2020. And I also want to mention that in 2010, I started a homeless shelter in Philadelphia that was run by college students and our goal was to link people in Philadelphia to services that they needed and work with them to get housing. Over the course of the last decade, it became much harder to move people from shelter into housing because a lot of our housing vouchers have dried up and much of the housing stock in Philadelphia that was public housing has come off of inventory. We're having public housing not only torn down, but also sold to private developers who are rehabbing them and then selling them on the private market. So we currently have 40,000 people on a wait list for public housing, and the wait list has been closed in Philadelphia since 2013. So with all of that in mind, my organization shifted from providing shelter to providing housing, and we are currently working on building the first village of tiny houses in Philadelphia. And if you want to learn any more about that, you can just Google Philadelphia and tiny housing because it's exciting work that we're doing. But I will move on by talking about this case study in Philadelphia. So in Philadelphia this summer, we really built on the work of Martin versus Boise that Maria was speaking about. And in using Martin versus Boise as really our model, we engaged in legal action and the largest self-organized housing takeover in the country. This involved months of public housing takeovers. So this was direct action, what people did, fueled by Jennifer Bennett and Sterling Johnson and Wiley Cunningham in Occupy PHA, which PHA is the Philadelphia Housing Authority. What this group did and our other mutual aid volunteers, including myself, is we went into vacant public housing units and took them over and put in mothers and children who were experiencing homelessness. This was at the start of the pandemic around March and April. So in the beginning of the pandemic, we had a crisis in homelessness before COVID hit, but COVID both exacerbated this crisis and also exposed it. In addition, we've had a cut in homeless shelter beds in Philadelphia over the years as shelters and housing have both been dramatically disinvested in from government. And so when COVID hit, the shelters, which were already, there was about a 4,000 bed gap between how many beds are provided. So about 12,000 beds provided in Philadelphia and 16,000 people trying to access those beds. So we already didn't have enough shelter beds in Philadelphia for all the people who needed them. But then shelter beds came offline because all the shelters were trying to limit their intake to allow for social distancing. So we already had too few shelter beds, and then COVID made it even worse. And so what you saw is more and more people sleeping outside. So first, we took over public housing, again, led by Occupy PHA, and put families in there. We were inspired by this work that's been actually happening throughout the country of basically homeless mothers and other homeless activists taking over public housing. And then we engaged in protest encampments. So the first real protest encampment was Occupy Wall Street, and we used that as a model, so that the encampments that grew in Philadelphia weren't just encampments, but we situated it in the framework of being also a protest for Black Lives Matter and a protest for housing. In that way, by tying the encampment into a protest, we made it a legal declaration that the police could not sweep the encampment because they would be infringing on our right to protest and our right to free speech. So this was very unusual for a homeless encampment to be set up as a protest. Again, it was kind of modeled off of Occupy Wall Street, but it is a model that I think should spread throughout the country in terms of encampments explicitly being set up as protests. So we not only had the protest encampment and the takeover of public housing, but we then went to the courts with eviction defense of those occupied houses and of the encampments. When the city threatened to sweep the encampments, we went to the court to prevent the city from doing that. And so I want to mention now the role of students in this work because it is vital. There are, I think too few lawyers who are able to do this work, especially in Philadelphia. So we depend on people who aren't lawyers, people who are law students, and other volunteers to help with litigation. So this image to the right of the screen is me and my student from Villanova Law School, Delaney Keefe. And Delaney Keefe and I and a supervising attorney named Michael Huff worked on litigation, a temporary restraining order. We organized the injunction to stop the city from sweeping. It was actually 3 large homeless encampments in Philadelphia with over 200 people in the encampments. And so we filed the temporary restraining order and the injunction in the Eastern District Court of Pennsylvania. And the petition enjoined the city of Philadelphia from destroying or dissipating the homeless encampments. Again, we used Martin versus Boise as a model, and we connected with Tristia Bauman from Maria's organization, National Homelessness Law Center. And I might be referring to the wrong name because I know that the organization has recently changed its name. Excuse me 1 second while I get my notes. The Tristia, who was involved in Martin versus Boise, helped us put together our case. I also want to make clear that in our current situation, some takeaways from COVID is that now we've all mastered Zoom, and that we can use that to our benefit because I was easily able to connect with lawyers like Tristia Bauman and Paul Bowden on the West Coast who could easily meet with us over Zoom regularly to help us build our case. And so if we're going to really make movement on the national level for a right to housing, I think what it entails is for grassroots organizations in the local level to communicate and collaborate with other activists doing this work in other cities, and Zoom makes that so much easier. So I'm grateful for Zoom and my ability to use it now. So what we did is we worked with law students, specifically Delaney Keefe, in all putting together this injunction and the TRO. This experience for Delaney gave her direct service and opportunities for building community with the people in the encampment. Delaney was able to learn so much of about the process of filing an injunction and then taking it to court. And it created a reciprocal partnership in service and advocacy where she was really working with the people experiencing homelessness, not for the people experiencing homelessness. So our plaintiffs were from the encampment and their voices were the ones highlighted. But this was an incredibly transformative experience for Delaney, as it would be, I think, for many, many law students. So I highly encourage the use of law students in this work. And in this work, we're really the people, especially at Villanova University, the law students are very close to the seat of power, and you are teaching teaching people who are close to the seat of power about systemic oppression when it comes to poverty and race. And so I think that it's vital to train these students through direct service. In terms of takeaways and how we can use this case study to really expand throughout this work throughout the country is through community organizing, what's called Street Watch or Cop Watch. And so we had organizers and volunteers throughout the city who would go to the encampments. Now, people were at the encampments because there was a lack of shelter and a lack of housing. However, in the encampments, they were able to be linked to a 24-hour medic. They were able to be linked to community, each other, food. And it was safer in the encampment than in the shelters where COVID was spreading and people were dying in the homeless shelters in Philadelphia. So being outside actually diminished their risk of contracting COVID, and they got regular COVID testing at the encampments. But volunteers were able to go and work on mutual aid. And in doing so, their bodies were used to protect people who were experiencing homelessness from the police. They could provide witnesses, gather documentation, link people in the encampments to lawyers and law students doing this work. So having I think what we need is really activists and lawyers to go to the places where people are experiencing homelessness and at risk of being criminalized. So specifically where the encampments are, we need bodies. And then with our direct action, the takeover of the housing, the protest encampment that included bodies like Delaney's, like mine, and like hundreds of other activists and volunteers throughout the city. All of that work led to a victory for this massive housing justice takeover. So in Philadelphia, what happened is, we actually, Delaney and I actually lost our case. So the city ruled that the judge ruled the city could sweep the encampment, even though we set this up as a right to free speech, a right to protest, a right to have people's property, because the sweeps often destroy people's property, such as their tents and their private belongings, and really a right to shelter, a right to a safe place and not to be criminalized if there's not shelter available. Despite all of that, the judge ruled against us. However, there was so much press about this case and about the encampments that it put a ton of pressure on the city of Philadelphia, which was already experiencing pressure because of Philadelphia earlier in the summer had tear-gassed protesters who were protesting George Floyd. And so there was a ton of pressure on the city to work well with the encampment. And so the city, under all of that pressure and under the pressure of the lawsuit, that even though the lawsuit didn't go in our favor, we lost the battle but won the war. So what happened is the city agreed to transfer 50 vacant houses into a community land trust used as extremely low-income housing. And managed by local control committees. The city has promised to make 300 more houses available, pave the way for the establishment of tiny home villages to house the homeless, which is what my organization is doing right now, and has vowed not to evict the families who took over those residents of the vacant houses. So all those families we put in the houses are still there, and they are protected from being evicted from the city. And so in order to build on this work, and this is an image of the plaintiffs in our case, who were the encampment residents, and on the left is Delaney, my law student. It is critical to have legal defense to protect homeless people's legal rights, provided in an environment designed to build power. So clinics or even makeshift meeting spaces where people who are homeless congregate at the encampments or near the encampments. Organizers and members of the legal community, including legal aid organizations, law students, pro bono law firms, and other activists who don't have law degrees or experience but can do a lot of research and paperwork to help legal process move forward. we can together assess the legal needs of people experiencing homelessness, record legislative action, document racial and disability discrimination, and then share that documentation and data with groups in other cities and clinics to help inform state and federal legislation. So I think collaborative work is key. We're all in our cities, but we're fighting the same thing. So we can do Zooms with other groups that are doing this work. There's encampments all throughout the country now, and there are people who are doing this work on the ground. And if we share our best practices and resources, we can build on Martin versus Boise and move forward and really try to promote the right to housing. And so lastly, I'll just leave you with, this is an image of us breaking ground. You have me and some of the city council members, my lawyer, and some of my students in this image of breaking ground on one of our first tiny home villages. So we'll be creating villages. These houses are meant to be permanent housing, affordable housing under 400 square feet, but fully functional with bathrooms and kitchens. And we're working on inclusive zoning and building code to allow for accessory dwelling spaces, to allow for tiny homes, to allow for more inclusive housing options, especially what is needed right now. These houses will be low barrier, meaning wheelchair accessible, pet friendly. There are many barriers to accessing housing, and affordability is only one of them. So we are designing the houses to be low barrier so that it can be truly inclusive, and people who have a variety of different disabilities or traumas or come with their pets are able to be housed in dignity. And we are creating community land trusts, and the houses will be a limited equity co-op. In that way, people who are living in the houses will have part ownership and can build equity over time, which is what we believe is needed, especially for the population of people who are experiencing homelessness and low income. So I just wanted to mention that as a case study and work we're doing in Philadelphia. It's collaborative work, and we need to share resources and really build our people power throughout the country through mutual aid, direct action, legal defense, taking the fight to the courts and to the press and to the streets. So that's it. Thank you so much. And I'll stop there because I think I'm over time.
Thank you to all three speakers. These were such rich and inspiring presentations. And I have so many questions, but I'm preempting myself because we've already started to gather, have started to gather a list of questions. The first set actually are follow-on questions, I think, from folks who are very interested in these models and in the issue of, or in the vein of replication of these things. So I have a couple of questions that I'm going to follow on Stephanie's presentation with. So the first couple are for you, Stephanie, and then I have one from Mark as well. So Stephanie, a couple of questions have come in. One from James Kanan. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your last names. You're all in this world of virtual Q&A. You're all going to sound like me. So the first from James Kanan, how did you enter the vacant units? And then let me just ask the second as well so that you could respond to them in a cluster, Stephanie. The second is from Narinda Hyatt, who directs a civil justice clinic in Newark, New Jersey, which does primarily housing work. And Narinda asks, who initiated this effort? We talk a lot about community-led actions. Did Villanova devise the plan and take it to the tenants, or was it vice versa?
Thank you for those questions. So I'll start with Villanova did not organize this. It was organized primarily by people who either are experiencing homelessness or people who have experienced homelessness. Very specifically, Jennifer Benich from Occupy PHA, which is, again, PHA is Philadelphia Housing Authority. And I was involved. There were many people involved in taking over the houses. So one of the questions was, how did you do it? And so this is incredibly important. What we did is we went on a website, a city-run website, where we were able to find out what lots, what units in the city were owned by the Philadelphia Housing Authority. We didn't want to just go into vacant houses that were privately owned. We specifically wanted vacant houses that were publicly owned by the city, because in the city, leaving those houses vacant, when we have 40,000 people on a wait list, we believe that they have already broken the social social contract by not filling those houses and letting them remain vacant. So we got a list of all the houses that were vacant. And then literally what we did is we went to the houses with a group of people, and we would look for telltale signs that the houses were vacant. Sometimes they were boarded up. And then before we touched the house, we made communication and connection with the neighbors. So we would go around to the neighbors and say, do you know if that house is vacant? Do you know anything about the house? Who lives in it? We would explain what we were doing, and we would enlist their help. And what we found is these houses were predominantly in North Philadelphia, and the people who were in the neighborhood have also been hurt by Philadelphia Housing Authority and other organizations, and they were very much in solidarity with us and very happy to help us. But I think that that's key, is bringing the community and neighborhood into the project, and help. And so then what we would do is we got tools. We took down the boarding. We would go into the houses, and then the houses were usually in decay. And we also believe that's bad for a neighborhood and for a block to have a house like that. So we would clean up the houses together, make sure that they were set up with heat and electricity, and then collect all kinds of furniture and move parents. Usually it was mothers and their children into the houses. But that's the very specific, and I want to highlight that this was, first of all, predominantly organized by people experiencing homelessness or who had experienced homelessness, with the help of other organizers and volunteers, including myself and many others. And that also it is key to enlist the help of the community and the neighbors, because it would be tremendously problematic to do this without their help or their knowledge. So I think I might have maybe answered both questions. There might have been others, but I don't want to speak too long.
I think you got it. Thank you. One thing before I share the question from Mark, someone asked, how do we ask questions? Let me remind you how to do that. So again, if you go to the session, session page, and you'll see on the right of your screen an area marked. I have such a long chat here, I can't tell what it's called. It's a chat, essentially a chat banner on the. For me, it's on the right hand of my screen. Hopefully it is for you as well. And you can type right in there at the bottom your question, and I will see it and be able to pick it up. If worst comes to worst, let me actually type my email address in the chat. You can email me your question, and I will also be monitoring my email. Okay, now, question for Mark in the meantime. Andrea Boyack, who is actually the secretary for the property law section, as well as I believe the chair of the real estate law section, so a property and real estate law person, asks, how is your regional measure funded? Is it sales tax or something else, or is it taken from existing budget revenues?
It's a good question. It is actually a tax on high income earning households and on high revenue generating businesses. So it really goes to where we've actually seen the greatest accumulation of wealth in our area, which is at the upper end of the income spectrum. So I think it's a 1% tax on the households with incomes above $200,000 if it's two households, and $150 if it's one. Although I may be off on the exact numbers there. And then the businesses, if they're generating profits above $5 million a year.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, question from Tim Iglesias, I believe directed at Stephanie. How did you arrange for water and electricity in these units?
So that was often really difficult to do. And there were a variety of different ways that we did it. Some questionably legal, but we would sometimes, I just saw what people did. I was not involved in this specifically. Sometimes when it came to air conditioning and heat, we would use things like space heaters and air conditioning units. We would hook up utilities to the general hookup for the rest of the block. Sometimes we would pay the bills, the heat and electric bills ourselves. So there were a variety of ways that we did it. It was probably one of the biggest challenges that we had, but not insurmountable. So that was something we had to first work on, and it was different for each house, but it was a combination of things, including hooking up through the lines on the block, hooking up the house to the power source on the block. But and the exact specifics of it were someone named Alex Stewart who helped with that. I just watched in awe, but or provided heaters and a lot of air conditioning units.
Okay. I'm going to go back to Mark now, try to bring different voices in all together. So Mark, a follow-up by Andrea Boyack is it taxing income or wealth? I think it must be a follow-on to your question that I'm afraid I missed, but hopefully you understand that piece of the question. And let me just add one more, and this is from Lynn Harmon Walker, also from Mark. Do law students or schools participate in what you're doing, and are there opportunities for them? So if you could try to answer both questions there, that would be great.
Sure. It's a tax on income. So my reference to wealth was that it's a tax that recognizes that over the last decade in our metro region, there's been an enormous growth in the overall wealth of the community, but that wealth has been highly concentrated at the upper end of the income spectrum. And so, this tax really goes to that, and then turns that resource back towards the folks who have the greatest need right now in our community. Then in terms of law students being involved, there are a number of clinics. Lewis and Clark has a law school here locally. They work very closely with our legal aid services organizations. So there's definitely work happening that law students are involved in a variety of ways with legal services. And we're working closely generally with legal services. Of course, they are advocates with us as local government when it comes to things like camp sweeps that we've been talking about, and around issues around tenant protections and the important work of kind of putting local legislative protections in place if we don't have the federal or state protections that the community feels like we need. So there are definitely ways that the legal students and public interest lawyers are vital to all of this work.
Question for all three of you. I'd love all three of your opinions on a question from Etienne Toussaint. Is there a downside to limited equity cooperatives in the long term? Etienne mentions the possibility that low-income members can't benefit fully from the gains in property values in the neighborhood, and then the question is, how does that affect the larger issues of wealth gap, income gap? So if all three of you could opine on that, and I might add onto that the exercising my prerogative as moderator, the sort of broader question. I mean, the question that Etienne asks, I think, is one that at least worries many property law folks, right? And there's perhaps a broader version of, or a broader manifestation of that worry that I might add on to that question, which is just what property rules might this idea of a right to housing disrupt, and how would you essentially articulate an argument that kind of disruption might be appropriate? So if I could put both of those questions on the table for all three of you to chew on in succession, that would be great. Whoever wants to go first, go for it.
I just will go quickly, and I'm only wading into this now, and depending on property lawyers who have done significant work in this area. But I think a couple things. One is that it's incredibly important to listen to and understand the concerns and the needs of the people experiencing homelessness. And so it might be a personal preference for somebody to not have a limited equity co-op. We wouldn't want to force this on somebody experiencing homelessness. And there could be a variety of reasons why somebody would not want partial ownership, including one question that comes to mind is if someone is collecting disability, and there's certain rules and restrictions around having certain assets like equity in housing, which might limit their ability to collect on disability, a variety of different things. And the other thing I just want to mention is that that the right to housing, in my mind, means that we are decommodifying housing, that housing is a right and not a privilege or a commodity. And the limited equity co-op is not necessarily decommodifying housing, because we're still talking about people having ownership of the house, as opposed to it being houses being jointly, collectively owned by the whole entire community. And potentially some like benevolent landlord or some nonprofit controls it or runs it. And so there might be a kind of disconnect between decommodifying housing and a limited equity co-op. But for our purposes, we're seeing limited equity co-ops kind of expanding as a model throughout the country and empowering people who have had, especially in Philadelphia, but I know elsewhere, people who have been on the margins and been denied mortgages and ownership. And in the country right now, our housing is where we build our wealth. And since many Black Philadelphians and Black people throughout the country have been denied mortgages, this creates a continuation of the wealth divide. So our thinking in terms of limited equity co-op is giving people who have been denied access to equity and ownership the ability to have that. But there are many different things to take in account, and there are concerns that we need to consider, including the decommodification of housing. So I'll just stop there and let Maria and Mark jump in, but those are some thoughts I have on it.
Maria, Mark? Maria, I believe you are muted still, so you just need to unmute yourself.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay. Thanks, Rashmi, and thanks, Etienne, for the question, and to you, Rashmi, also. So on the limited equity ownership, I do think there's an equity concern there. This, to me, is, it's a model for increasing the supply of affordable housing, but it's a kind of it has its limitations. And to the extent that housing is a principal way of building wealth in this country, and that so many people have been denied that opportunity deliberately, people of color, Black people have been deliberately kept out of that we really need to consider that, and also think expansively beyond home ownership and property ownership as a wealth building mechanism. So that's, my limited thoughts on that question. But on the bigger question of disrupting concepts of property law, so I think the biggest disruption is, it's often said that the U.S. has a system of negative rights. Our legal system is designed to protect us from government, which is basically protecting individuals from community needs, and thinking about housing and other economic and social rights as rights along the lines of human rights law, which doesn't make this distinction, which looks at civil rights and economic and social rights together, and in fact is interdependent, means breaking down that division between negative and positive rights as well, and thinking that, right now property law protects property. What about a system where we're prioritizing protecting people? And I think that's a fundamental switch. And it's actually not that, it's a switch in how we think about it and talk about it, really. Because right now, there is a right to housing in the United States, but it's a very limited right. It's for people who are property owners, right? There's the mortgage interest deduction. That's a right. If you qualify, you get that benefit. It's not limited. It's not discretionary. It's a right under our tax system. So that's a housing right that's already there, but it's only there if you already have a home. So it's really just changing how we think about this and thinking about it more expansively. But that's a huge disruption, I think.
Mark, if I could interject one further question that's so related to this that I thought I'd throw it on the table for you to react to as well. So Faisal Chowdhury asks such a related question, again, for all of you, and I think you've already started to answer it, which is do we need to rethink the choice to frame this struggle as being about a right to housing? He continues, while this may be more consistent with the U.S. tradition, in much of the rest of the world, these matters are framed around the question of social housing and decommodifying shelter. Are we not at the point in the U.S., amidst the evident indifference of prevailing ideology to social need that COVID has made so apparent to, where it would make sense to relax the exceptionalism with which we approach these concerns, especially given how unsuccessful rights discourse has generally been? The conservative counter-revolution against it having begun already as that middle way compromise discourse was taking off from the 1940s to the 1960s. So a little bit more for you to chew on as you react, Mark. You're still muted.
Okay. That's a fantastic question, and I don't feel well equipped to answer it. I will say that on this question about limited equity, I think it is in this category of questions that we're faced with all the time, which sort of take the form of, well, we know what we should be doing. We should be giving everybody an equitable opportunity for wealth building and wealth creation, and we're not actually prepared to do that. We haven't made that choice. And so what are some, semi-measures that we can take that move us in that direction a little bit? And frankly, we run into this with I raised it in my conversation, because we have such constrained resources for building housing. Although we have plenty of wealth that we could offer everyone who was in a single person household, a studio or a one bedroom apartment, the costs of that are becoming prohibitive. And so we're talking about reintroducing the SRO as a model. In part, there may be circumstances where that's a good form of housing, but partly because it's less expensive. And so we're making these compromises in light of not the way that we know we could be or should be, but the realities that we face on the ground every day with what happens if, with a limited budget, I build 10 units or 15 units, that's 5 more people on the street or fewer people on the street, depending. That's how we end up looking at this, which isn't how we have to look at it, except based on the decisions we've made about how to allocate resources in our community. I'm fascinated what the others have to say about this question about moving towards a narrative of social housing. I'm with Maria on the sort of notion that we need to move towards a positive rights framework and away from a negative rights framework when it comes to these basic social goods. And that's about all that I feel like I can say to that question.
We only have about a minute left. Let me ask any of you who would like 20 seconds to make any final closing comments in reaction to these questions, to please feel free to do so. I'm assuming you 3 speakers have not had a chance to monitor the chat. We've had other excellent questions that I regret that we can't get to, but hopefully there's a way to capture those. And maybe what I'll do is look for a way to share whatever answers you might have afterwards with those who asked them. But any closing commentary before we close out? And then I want to be sure to tell you all about the second panel that's coming up at 4:15.
I do want to just jump in really quick to add a recommendation for a book for anyone who's watching. It's by a lawyer named Dean Spade, and it's called Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During This Crisis and the Next. It was just published, and this crisis is referring to COVID specifically. But it's an excellent book. It's incredibly short, and you can read it probably within an hour. And I highly encourage any participants to get a hold of it, because it gives an incredibly important framework for how you build solidarity, build organization, and grassroots movement making, especially when it comes to housing justice and housing activism. So that'll be my only part is everyone check out Dean Spade's book. I don't know him, so I'm not his agent. I just happen to read the book and think it's fabulous, and encourage anyone watching to get that book for yourself.
Thank you. Maria, Mark, any final comments?
Thank you very much for putting this together. It's really important and it's very timely. I mean, I really do think we have an opportunity now where the pandemic has really highlighted not only the need, but also the necessity, I think, for thinking more broadly and for thinking in terms of concepts like social housing. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Well, then let me take this opportunity to thank the three of you. If we were in a room physically together, you would hear much applause, but at least you'll see my hands clapping, and really, I'm so grateful to the three of you for your time, and to my co-organizers for sharing the task of bringing us all together. Everyone who has been a part of this session, take a look at the chat. There have been wonderful resources and comments shared. Speakers, you should certainly take a look at it because there are many kudos for the three of you. And everyone who's here, please take note that in 15 minutes, I believe there's a different Zoom link. You will need to sign on to a different Zoom link if you would like to, and we hope you will, continue this discussion by hearing 4 presentations of works in progress, as well as comments on those presentations, and being able to engage with each of those 4 sets of speakers as well. So again, to the three of you, thank you so much, and to our audience, thank you also. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.